Hey everybody, Coldar here. Today we are looking at Heroic Will of the Emperor in Mogu'shan. So the heroic version of this encounter only has two major differences. So I'll talk about the first one of those briefly. It's pretty minor. But then the second change is really the core of the encounter on heroic. So I'll get into that in a lot of detail. So the first change is simply that you start the fight by destroying the sets of pipes on either side of the room as you enter, and doing so triggers the fight rather than activating the console at the top. This also releases Titan gas into the room, so just like you're used to on normal, Titan gas does AE damage to the raid and increases melee damage dealt by both players and the constructs and the Emperor bosses as well by 25%. However, on heroic, you basically break these pipes, so you have gas the entire time. So this makes things a little bit more difficult in that there's constantly 15,000 damage ticks on everyone in the raid every second. So it sort of gives people, such as myself, who specialize more in raid healing, something to do throughout the fight. But also, of course, means that all the mobs, especially the bosses, are more dangerous because they're going to do that extra bit of damage if you're not careful. So just be careful of Titan gas, make sure you have some way to manage the healing required, and otherwise just avoid damage whenever possible from the bosses and the ads, and it won't be a big deal. So the second big change on heroic is Titan sparks, and this is the absolute key to this encounter on heroic. Properly managing sparks is what makes or breaks this fight. So, the way sparks work is anytime any enemy unit dies in this fight, so if you look on the top left there is the strength, it's about to die. When an enemy dies, it will spawn a Titan spark out of its body at that current location. After about 4 or 5 seconds of spawning, that spark will become activated and start moving toward a randomly selected target that it's fixated on. So you can see there I'm targeted by the spark in the back right. So it's slowly moving toward me. Now, when a spark reaches melee range with any player, whether it's the fixated player or not, it will explode, dealing 750,000 nature damage to anyone within 8 yards. So pretty small radius. And it will also increase the attack speed of any enemy within 8 yards as well by 50%, and this lasts 2 minutes and stacks. So what this means is if a spark explodes near an ad or a boss, that ad or boss will attack 50% faster for 2 minutes, and this of course stacks if you do it over and over. So there are these two conflicting mechanics here. Obviously 750,000 nature damage is massive, and properly managing that damage is the key to this fight. However, you would normally be inclined to have your tanks soak such damage, but because of the addition of the attack speed buff that enemies will gain if they explode near an enemy, this means your tanks on the bosses can't really help you with this. If they soak an explosion, then chances are the boss that they're tanking are going to be within that 8 yards as well, and do 50% faster attacks. You can't really afford that. So, the core of this encounter is for the other 8 raid members to figure out a way to deal with these sparks. And doing that, there's a lot of different ways to go about it. So I'll talk a little bit about the timings that are involved here. I'll talk about what it is that our raid is doing and why. And then I'll talk about many of the other options that are available to different raid compositions. So as mentioned, since the sparks spawn from the corpses of killed ads in this fight, the timing of sparks is basically the timing of the ads. So when you engage this fight, you obviously don't start with the bosses right away. You wait for a while, deal with some ads first, and then the bosses appear. You get some more ads, and then you get your break period, where no ads will spawn for a while, and when the period is over, then ads will come again. So the way the timing actually works is that ads are spawned in chunks which are basically equivalent to 3 sets of rages, or 6 rages total, 2 strengths, and 1 courage. That's an add chunk. And these chunks are basically done over a period of around a minute 30, a little bit over, maybe a minute 35 on average. So basically the time between rages is 30 to 35 seconds, strengths is around 50 seconds, and courage is around a minute 40 or so. These are between those spawn types within an ad set. Now, when you engage the fight, you start with adds, so you actually start your first ad set right away. So you'll get your first set of 3 rages, your first 2 strengths, your first single courage, and then you'll immediately get a second ad set following that one around when the bosses are active too. So again, you'll get another set of 3 rages, another 2 strengths, and another courage. After that, your 2 back-to-back ad sets, you get your break period. So the break period is around a minute 10, minute 15, and then you get 1 more ad set, again 3 rage sets, 2 strengths, 1 courage, and then another break period, another ad set, another break period, and so on. It repeats like that till the end of the fight. So it's only that initial 2 ad sets back to back that is different throughout the fight. At any rate, because of these timings, you can figure out how many sparks you'll get over a given period and how you'll be able to deal with them. So for that first initial 2 sets of ads, you've got 18 mobs over 3 minutes 5 seconds. So that's 1 spark every 10.3 seconds. And then through all the remainder of the fight, including break periods, it's only 1 spark every 16 seconds. So it's obviously very frequent, but the most challenging part of this fight is up front, and that's actually good. So you can get the difficult part out of the way, and then things are a lot smoother later on. Now, before I get into how we decided to handle sparks and some of the other ways, let's talk a little bit about another option, which is to actually kill the sparks. So you'll notice that sparks have about 1.6 or closer to 1.7 million health each. And although they do chase players, you can, of course, DPS them and kill them. I don't recommend this. This would be something that should be a last resort because you need to focus a lot of damage in other areas in this fight. But if worst comes to worst and you can't figure out another way to do it, you have a lot of DPS, this is an option. The reason it's bad is because, as I mentioned, the frequency of sparks is very high. And if you are killing them all, that's an extra 1.7 million damage per spark. So just using our previous calculations, during the first 2 ad sets at the start of the fight, killing sparks is another 165,000 raid DPS that's required. Even during the downtime periods plus the follow-up ad sets that are later in the fight, that's still over 100,000 raid DPS extra that you would need to deal to the sparks. Not to mention that melee DPS can't help you since getting in melee range triggers the explosion. It has to be all range DPS. So there's probably a happy medium somewhere in there, soaking the sparks that you can reliably and killing off 1 or 2 here or there if you can't find another way to do it. But as I said, in my recommendation, killing them is the last resort. You should try to find a way to absorb the damage and soak it in some way, and then you can worry about actually killing them if you can't find a way to do that. So let's talk a little bit about the method that we decided to use for handling sparks. We tried a lot of different setups, and I'll talk about some of those in a bit, but the method that we settled on is what I would just refer to as soaking. So basically this describes having 1 player who's able to completely absorb or mitigate the spark damage, the 750,000 AE damage, from virtually every spark that spawns, and then healing that damage in some way after the fact. So there are a lot of ways to do this, but with our raid composition, the way that we found was for our druid, who is normally balance, to gear up and spec Guardian. and basically maximize her stamina so that her hit points are as high as possible, and therefore give her a big enough margin to safely absorb sparks. So bear druids have 25% magic reduction innately, which means that we knew from the start that the 750,000 would never hit her for more than 562,500. From there, then we just have to assume how much, margin of error we want to give her in terms of health, as well as consider that she's going to be taking damage from Titan gas as well, which is another around 11,000 per tick on her. So basically we account for 2 or 3 ticks of Titan gas before we start healing her, plus the 562,000 damage that it would hit her maximally, and then you get a little bit under 600,000. So that's basically our margin. If her health is above 600,000, then she can safely absorb a spark. If it is below that, then she has to wait until she's healed up. So her total health in this raid was around 690,000, and that was plenty high enough for this. And believe it or not, even though that's a pretty high number, the eye level needed for that is not that great. Basically, she just gathered as much gear as she could, miscellaneous that none of our main specs needed through our raids. Got some PvP gear, some 5-man gear, LFR gear, all that good stuff, and was able to put it together pretty quickly. So props to her for doing that, and it helped us immensely. So as I said, 690,000, that's 90,000 plus more than we need to be safe, quote unquote. And this really made this fight so much easier. So essentially she stays bear form the whole time, and obviously as far as the fight is concerned, this is another tank, so just be wary that courage can target this other player if you have another tank spec player. But you can see there, when the 2 rages die, she just stays in bear form, jumps up, aggroes or soaks the spark damage, and then we heal her after each hit of that spark damage. A simple weak aura or indicator telling her when her health is above or below that required threshold means that she can delay soaking a spark if she didn't get healed right away for some reason, if we're busy healing someone else. But otherwise, she can arguably soak every single spark. Now, we decided to have her soak only those from the rage and the strength because they tend to be in the same area. And then the courage we actually have handled by another player, in this case our DPS shaman, because he just is always near the courage. He's kind of the primary snare for it, and he has enough cooldowns he can cool down it by himself without any outside help for the most part. So otherwise, we have our druid doing all the spark soaking. So very simple, very straightforward, makes things very easy in this sense, and so highly recommend it. If you have access to that, you have a feral druid already in your raid or that kind of thing, they can do this pretty easily. So if you have raid composition more suited to using cooldowns to soak sparks, then you can use that method as well. And it's very similar to the soaking method, except rather than having just a high hit point or high mitigation player to absorb them like a tank, instead you have as few people as possible with the strongest personal cooldowns available to then soak the sparks and survive in much the same way. Generally speaking, the cooldown methods will require a lot less healing to, mitigate the damage. Generally, you'll want as much mitigation in the cooldown as possible, so you're not having to heal anything. But it can be more complicated as well, depending on, how much you have available to your raid. And there are a lot of options. So we'll talk about those in a little bit. But for example, probably the strongest class available for this role is a rogue. It doesn't really matter the spec, but basically a rogue with feint has innately 50% reduced damage from AE effects. Then with the elusiveness talent, this is reduced to 65% total. So you can essentially have a rogue soak every single spark if so desired, similar to what our druid is doing here, but taking, very little damage in the process. And you just heal them up after, and pretty simple. Another very strong example would be a hunter who is using deterrence with the talent to reduce its cooldown to 60 seconds. And with a 60-second cooldown, it's obviously 100% avoidance on the damage. It's very common for raid groups to have the hunter soak 4 rage sparks simultaneously. So basically, a set of 2 rages will spawn. They CC those until 33 seconds later when the next set spawns. Then the group AEs 4 rages down simultaneously, causing 4 sparks to spawn pretty much at the same time in the same location. And then you have the hunter run in with the turrets, soak every spark in that set of 4, and take no damage from it. Then you CC the next set of rages, and then you kill the 4 rages when the next set spawns after that. And by then, the 60-second cooldown of deterrence is available again, and the hunter repeats the process. So probably the second most powerful example. And, obviously this means that only the strength sparks and the courage sparks must be dealt with by the raid itself. So it's a really good way to do it. And there are, of course, varying degrees of, how strong cooldowns are for this example. But that's basically the idea of using cooldowns. So you pretty much want to order the strength of your cooldowns, based on how much they mitigate in damage, and of course also what their actual cooldown time is, how long between being able to use them. The fewer people you can have involved in this process, the better. Also, the fewer people you can have on any given type of spark, the better. So if you can have, say, 1 or 2 people handling all the rages and 1 person handling all the strength sparks, 1 person all the courage sparks, this is a lot easier just for people to keep track of, and will simplify things a lot. So, as I mentioned, the real determination of how your raid will handle sparks is just based on your composition. There are a huge number of cooldowns that are available to any given raid depending on your makeup. And I won't list them all here because it's just a huge list, but I'll put a link in the description. You can see the spreadsheet that we used when we were figuring out some of the cooldowns available. Basically what you want to do is, if you're using a cooldown method, figure out the strongest cooldowns you have available to you with the fewest number of players that can reliably soak sparks over and over. So again, as I mentioned, probably in order of strength would be rogue with feint, then a hunter deterrence, then probably, either a blood death knight with anti-magic shell, bone shield, all that stuff, high hit points, or maybe a feral druid soaker. Monks are also very strong. They have a lot of cooldowns. So anyway, you can look at the list and kind of figure out for yourself what you have available. All right, so lastly, let's get into a little bit of the tips for, executing the fight overall. As I said, really it's all about figuring out how you want to handle sparks. But once you have that down and you got your pattern set, who's soaking which sparks and when, then it's really just about handling the ads properly and, organizing DPS in a way to control them. So DPS should first and foremost focus on the courage if there's one spawned. But the key thing is getting it snared quickly. Once it's slowed, then DPSing it is not as big of an issue. So you can see in the top right corner there, our enhancement shaman is ready for that courage. As soon as it drops down, he's right there, which is exactly what we want, and gets it snared and starts DPSing it. So he does the vast majority of damage to those, and that's sort of his role. I mentioned before, having people assigned to particular roles is really good for this fight because you have a lot going on. So you have a couple people helping with sparks and a couple people DPSing rages and 1 person on the strength, 1 or 2 people focusing on courage, all that stuff. It will simplify things a great deal. Otherwise, make sure your DPS are focusing on the rages. They are susceptible to CC, of course, so try to use snares on them if you have them available. We didn't have a lot of range snares available, unfortunately. But you can use like void tendrils from priests or traps from hunters, shaman totems perhaps, anything like that. Also stun them, of course, anytime you can. And then rages are much easier if they're not beating on anyone, of course. Strengths, fairly simple, just like normal, really. You should have one melee DPS assigned to handle the strength, if at all possible. They should never really get hit by their attack. They can dodge them all. And then DPS can help with strengths whenever they're not busy with the courage or the rage. But otherwise, the strength is the last priority. Once the adds are under control, then it's just a matter of transitioning between adds to the bosses and back. So as I mentioned, adds are in sets, which would be 6 rages, 2 strengths, 1 courage. And then you get that break period where you're on the bosses. So for the berserk time in this fight, you should get a total of 4 break periods, which would be technically 6 sets of adds, although like I said, the first set of adds is actually doubled, so it's 1 set in the beginning, and then a break, and then add, break, add, break, add, break. And by then, berserk is pretty much hitting. So you'll probably see at the end here, we basically noticed that we're coming up on a break period after, I believe, this set of rages. Yeah, I think it is. And so we focus on CCing the rages, having our druid who's soaking sparks pick up the strength, so our DPS warrior who's normally doing it can DPS the bosses, and then we just burn the bosses from there. So once you're at a comfortable point where you know that the bosses will die within a certain amount of time, you can just CC the rages and control the strength and then go to town from there. So there you can see a hex, some roots, all that good stuff. And oh, I think this strength actually dies because there's another one coming up after it. And we didn't quite handle that courage correctly, but yeah. Oh, that's a good tip though, is if a courage gets close to the strength, make sure you let it come out away from the boss a little bit before you soak it, so that the boss does not get that 50% attack speed buff from being too close. All right, there we go. So now you can see strength is being controlled by the druid. And we got 2 more rages, so we're going to CC these. And then the bosses are getting pretty low. So that's about it. That's Heroic Will the Emperor. If you can figure out how to handle sparks, then you should have this no problem. Good luck, and thanks for watching.